The final item of business today is the members' business debate on motion number 5112 in the name of Joan McAlpine on South of Scotland Television. This debate will be concluded without any questions being put, and I would be grateful if those members who wish to speak in the debate could press the request to speak buttons as soon as possible. And I call on Joan McAlpine to open the debate. 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I take the opportunity to thank colleagues across the Chamber who will contribute to this debate today? Presiding Officer, the granting of commercial public sector TV licences is a complex matter which is done by the regulator Ofcom after consultation with the UK Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport, Maria Miller. In November last year, Ms Miller announced that she would allow the renewal of Channel 3 licences across the UK for another 10 years, subject to negotiation. Ms Miller's announcement was broadly welcomed by the industry for understandable reasons. Commercial pressures have been considerable in the last decade as advertising revenues have declined. The renewal offers a period of stability, and I am pleased that Scottish Television, a company which in recent years has exceeded its regulatory requirements for opt-out Scottish programming, will continue to hold the licence for Central and Northern Scotland. However, none of the programmes made about Scotland by STV, including the much-acclaimed Scotland Tonight, are shown in the former border TV area of the south of Scotland, which takes in around 200,000 people from Stranraer and Dumfries in the west to the borders towns in the east. This means that viewers miss out on information about services which are decided in this Scottish Parliament, the things they really care about, like health, education and justice. And unless things change, they will have less information than other Scots about the referendum of 2014 from both sides of the argument. In addition to this curtailed national dimension, the local news covering the Scottish side of the border is inadequate. In February 2009, ITV Borders and ITV Tyne Tees merged, making 51 of the 64 staff at Border TV redundant. Operations for ITV Border, including news, moved from Carlisle to Gateshead, and capacity to cover local news and current affairs was reduced. Now many of my constituents will tell you that the news service pre-2009 was far from perfect, but since 2009 the level of dissatisfaction has increased considerably. The main regional news programmes are ITV News, Tyne Tees and Look Around, which airs at 6 p.m. with a short bulletin at 10:30 p.m. each day. Ofcom research conducted at the request of Ms Miller last year concluded that viewers in the south of Scotland were significantly less satisfied than those further north with coverage of Scottish news, with only 49% responding positively compared to 64% and 74% in central and northern Scotland respectively. Viewers in southern Scotland, according to Ofcom, felt stories from the urban north-east of England and Carlisle dominated the programme, and the location of Tyne Tees in Gateshead was seen as a real problem. I have had a number of constituents complain and offer specific examples. For example, Andrew Simpson of Dumfries told me that the local TV coverage this week of high-speed rail focused on the residents of a place called Church Fenton near York, who were concerned about the value of their houses and how these would drop because of the proximity of the railway. In addition to individual comments like this, my motion has received support from organisations such as the Scottish Borders Chamber of Commerce, and a spokesman told me today that the Chamber's view is that the simple question needs to be asked: will we get better coverage of the borders by being connected to STV or a station with its HQ in the north of England? More coverage can only be good for our local business and tourism. So many great things are happening in the borders right now, and we feel that it's just not getting the coverage it deserves. Also, the borders are part of Scotland, and it's simply ridiculous that at the time of a referendum on Scottish independence, we're not able to receive programmes such as Scotland Tonight. It's such as the strength of feeling in the Borders Chamber of Commerce that they intend to hold their own event in May this year on the future of the media in the borders. If we look at past coverage of Scottish political issues in this regional TV area, the 2012 local elections provide a good illustration of the disparity between coverage in the ITV Border Tyne Tees region and STV, which showed a number of special reports. You will see from the briefing provided by ITV that the offering in Scotland is more popular than other regional Channel 3 news programmes, and ITV also argue that the Ofcom research I quoted earlier showed that the greatest demand was for more local news, and few individuals in the focus group interviewed spontaneously asked for additional coverage from Scotland. But there are reasons for this. The south of Scotland is poorly served by the BBC. The BBC in the south has some excellent journalists, but capacity has been scaled back in recent years. The only place for local news is Channel 3, and that's why viewers tune in to look around, hoping that they'll see something local, often in vain. It's true also that Ofcom research findings demonstrate a greater demand for local news. However, when asked, the people did say the choice of Scottish news was inadequate, and industry experts have pointed out to me that the Ofcom questions were framed in such a way that the respondents would ask for coverage that they had already lost due to the merger. It's much more difficult to expect people to ask for something that they've never had in the first place. You can't miss what you've never had in the first place. But there's also a democratic aspect to this debate. At the moment, the BBC is the only provider of national Scottish news and current affairs in the south of Scotland. If the BBC was the only provider of news and current affairs for the whole of the UK, with no Sky or ITN, we would not regard that as satisfactory or democratic. Indeed, one of the reasons why the Jimmy Savile affair damaged the BBC so much was the perception that people were not told the whole story and that the BBC had somehow covered up his crimes, leaving it to commercial rivals to expose him. In its last public service broadcasting review, Ofcom research found that 86% of UK viewers thought plurality of news provision among the television channels was really important, with 77 assigning a similar value to current affairs. And that's reflected in the Scottish research carried out for the Scottish Broadcasting Commission in 2010 that found that 3/4 of viewers wanted a choice of providers for Scottish television news. So, Presiding Officer, where do we go forward from here? My own preference, and I believe that of the Scottish Government, was for a single Scottish licence, and it's significant that Wales will get a new countrywide licence from 2014 at Maria Miller's instruction. And my quote earlier from the Scottish Borders Chamber of Commerce suggests that they also had that view, but this isn't possible unless ITV consent, and ITV have not consented. I am pleased that Maria Miller has asked Ofcom to work with ITV to address the poor news offering in the Borders region. However, I am extremely concerned that ITV is in denial about the problem. In a letter to the Clerk of the Education and Culture Committee last February, Magnus Brook, Director of Regulatory Affairs at ITV, insisted the company was serving viewers in Border highly effectively. They have now been forced to accept the findings of the Ofcom research showing that this isn't the case, but the ITV briefing to MSPs for this debate seems grudging, complaining about the cost of provision and suggesting that demands for Scottish content are political. There's a long way to go, and Ofcom must be forceful in this matter and demonstrate that although it reports to the UK Parliament, it appreciates the distinctive needs of Scotland as a nation and also the particular requirement of our rural communities like the south of Scotland, which will be more expensive to serve no matter who serves them. There is an easy way forward. ITV could negotiate with STV to take their non-news programming like Scotland Tonight, and ITV could then provide a local opt-out, providing real in-depth coverage of the south of Scotland. Given the political choices facing Scotland at the moment, I would expect Ofcom to be far more proactive in facilitating such an agreement as soon as possible, long before the licence is renewed, for the sake of democracy as well as choice. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I now turn to the open debate, and I call Elaine Murray to be followed by Aileen MacLeod.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I start by congratulating Joan McAlpine on securing this debate, because TV coverage in the south of Scotland is an issue which has caused a degree of contention over the years. Indeed, prior to the introduction of digital TV, many of us were actually unable to access BBC Scotland either on analogue signal, and that was extremely frustrating. And it's in some ways some of the frustrations have died down a bit because we are now able to get BBC Scotland in my constituency. I appreciate this, may not have been the case across the whole of the former TV area, but viewers in Dumfries and Galloway were generally content with the service that had previously been offered by Border TV. And I read with interest Joan McAlpine's column in yesterday's Daily Record, and she compared it to people in the south of England receiving news from France. I don't think that is the case for people in the eastern part of Dumfries and Galloway, because we are actually interested in Carlisle. It's the near city for most of my constituents. Indeed, in much of eastern Dumfriesshire, Carlisle is at least as accessible as Dumfries, and that has been sometimes to the disadvantage of the town of Dumfries. And residents travel there for work, they travel there for leisure, retail. Probably they're more interested in what's happening in Carlisle than what's happening in Edinburgh or Glasgow. However, and indeed colleagues from the south of Scotland may recall in the early days of this Parliament, we were very well served by Border TV, with dedicated staff being based in this building, regularly interviewing us on all manner of issues, including the legislative programme and everything else. But unfortunately, tough times in competition with new media hit the broadcasting sector, and as Joe McAlpine said, Border TV was subsumed into the larger ITV Tyne Tees region. And I think it was this that created most of the dissatisfaction, certainly in Dumfries and Galloway, or the eastern part. And indeed, the research commissioned by Ofcom last year bears out what I've heard from many of my constituents, that the area of coverage was now too large. People aren't interested in local news from Sunderland and Newcastle, which they rarely visit. And there is indeed a perception that the share of the news local to our area has been reduced. But now that we can receive BBC Scotland, the lack of a national Scottish component of the ITV news is perhaps of less concern. Well, I'm certainly not saying it's of no concern. I think it's maybe of less concern than it was previously, because a lot of viewers access the BBC for national news and then hope to go to Channel 3 to catch up with the local news. I'm sorry, I've only got the 4 minutes, sorry about that. And the local news does actually include news about Dumfries and Galloway Council. I know also that Joan was a bit concerned in her column about whether councils were getting enough news on. I don't know about news coverage in other council areas, but certainly Dumfries and Galloway Council does get some TV coverage, maybe not as much as we would like. And despite all we say about, and we do say about ITV Tyne Tees, the news programme Look Around actually still attracts a higher percentage of viewers, just under 50% in the Scottish border area, a higher percentage it does in the entire Tyne Tees border area, and significantly more than either ITV or STV do in general across their areas of broadcast. So we complain about it, but we do still like Look Around. However, given the responses to the research commissioned by Ofcom, which I said, in my view, do reflect general opinion, I am pleased to learn that the ITV, that the organisation is planning to introduce an enhanced and a more distinct news service for the border area, and that it's also taking into account what they described, and I'm not sure whether it was intended to be offensive or not, but what they described as a political desire for a higher Scottish content. However, ITV argue, and this is where one begins to worry, that the expenditure per capita in the Tyne Tees border area is already higher than any other ITV region. That's probably due to sparsity of population, I would suggest, and that these enhancements would incur additional expenses which ITV could say that they feel could be disproportionate. And it becomes difficult to see how this circle can be squared. Ofcom has been tasked by the Secretary of State to find a way forward which preserves or strengthens the public service broadcasting commitment
I'm
and
afraid I have
addresses
to
the
ask you to finish.
need for a greater proportion of local news and increased Scottish content. And I do hope that, given these addresses, that these issues have been correctly identified, that the next way forward has to be a way of actually agreeing how you further improve the local TV news services in the border TV area of Scotland.
Thank you. I must ask members if they could keep to 4 minutes, please. Aileen MacLeod, to be followed by John Lamont.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I too would like to congratulate my colleague Joe McAlpine in securing this debate on an issue which is of real importance and concern across constituents in the Borders and Dumfries and Galloway. And I'm also pleased that we're pursuing this issue as a Parliament, especially given the number of constituents who have been in touch with us about the ongoing concerns they have surrounding the continuing poor coverage that they receive. And members will recall the debate on this subject in October 2011, and the concerns that my colleagues and I raised then have certainly not gone away, but they have in the meantime been surveyed, assessed and collated by Ofcom, and perhaps now that the regulator, the UK Culture Secretary Maria Miller and ITV can see the level of dissatisfaction amongst the viewing public in the South of Scotland for themselves, rather than simply listening to expressed here, they will start to take a proper interest in actually improving the situation. And let's be clear, the situation certainly needs to be improved. Now, respondents to the Essential Research Survey for Ofcom said that the ITV border Tyne Tees area is too large and that they feel reporting is skewed towards the urban centres of the north east of England. So I welcome Maria Miller's recognition that the warnings given in 2009 and the concerns raised here in 2011 are well founded, and I'm slightly encouraged, by her request that ITV and Ofcom address the unmet demand for local news and Scottish programming for the South of Scotland, but we do need to still see real action. Presiding Officer, I believe there is a fundamental misunderstanding of the South of Scotland audience. You know, the South of Scotland is a rich tapestry of distinctive communities, and ITV has, in my view, an ideal market for a different and very local model of TV if it is only bold enough to try it. And if they choose not to, the alternatives are increasingly clear. When the Scottish Government favours a Scottish digital channel, a key recommendation of the Scottish Commission on Broadcasting, and that is also strongly supported by bodies which have been working hard on local TV for the South of Scotland, such as the South of Scotland Alliance and the Scottish Local Television Federation. And there are now a number of hyper-local TV channels across Scotland, including Annandale TV in the south. When people don't like what they've got, they will always find ways of doing it themselves. And at the moment, hyper-local TV is hindered by broadband speeds and broadband availability across a very rural region. But its next-generation broadband is rolled out with the assistance of the Scottish Government. Those technical obstacles will start to fall. There is nothing ultimately to protect any commercial television company's news provision from the same fate that has befallen print journalism through the growth of the internet. Nothing except perhaps the willingness to change, to move away from large multi-regional conglomerations that please nobody and give viewers the content that they actually want rather than what suits their company. And as matters stand, people from Dromore to Eyemouth learn more in their local TV news about what happens in Carlisle and Gateshead than they see news from their own areas, and they will hear much more about Carlisle City Council instead of the decision that their own elected local members make over vital services in the Borders and Dumfries and Galloway. Mention of events here that affect the region is fleeting at best, and as my colleague Joe McAlpine said, both sides of the arguments on Scotland's independence referendum will lose out. Presiding Officer, nowhere else in Scotland, and certainly nowhere else in Britain, would tolerate this. And it's up to Ofcom, the UK Culture Secretary and ITV to come up with a better offer. And I hope that it will be substantial, but it certainly cannot be more of the same.
Thank you. Call John Lamont to be followed by Chick Brodie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome tonight's opportunity to debate television services in the South of Scotland and congratulate Joan McAlpine on securing parliamentary time to discuss this issue. The quality as well as the plurality of television programming is a matter of great importance in the Borders constituency that I represent, especially when it comes to national and local news provision. The UK broadcasting map is a complicated business, with licensee boundary lines seemingly drawn more by historical accident than careful planning, with the result that licence boundaries do not directly duplicate geographical ones. Not only that, but in the South of Scotland, the profile of the Borders television has changed significantly since the amalgamation of ITV Borders with Tyne Tees in 2009. For many, this was one merger too far, with viewers on the Borders becoming understandably upset at the loss of regionally tailored services that resulted, in place of programming and news coverage from areas that were of little local interest or local interest. It comes therefore as little surprise to me that contentment levels with Channel 3 have been in decline, with satisfaction with Scottish news programmes in particular decreasing by 9% between 2007 and 2010. It was against this background that the UK Culture Secretary Maria Miller announced in November of last year that Channels 3 and 5 are to have their licences renewed for another 10 years in 2014. This move is, of course, to be welcomed, giving, as it does, much-needed certainty to the broadcasting industry dependent on those channels and the significant investment they attract in their regions. The Secretary of State has instructed Ofcom to begin discussions with current licence holders on the cost and terms of possible renewals, and I agree with, as well as endorse, the two issues that she has significantly highlighted as important components of any negotiations. Firstly is the need for licence holders to maintain or increase current levels of public service requirements. The second is a requirement for careful scrutiny of proposals advanced by ITV, which could leave viewers in the South of Scotland with a lower level of Scottish programming than elsewhere in Scotland. On the first point, it is of course essential that licensees deliver quality public service programming. On that basis, it is pleasing to see that Ofcom's recent report, Licensing of Channels 3 and Channel 5, concluded that licensees of both services exceeded their respective production and programming obligations between 2007 and 2010. However, whilst exceeding current obligations is to be applauded, this does not mean we should not be pushing further. The Secretary of State has secured increased commitments for UK-sourced children's programming in Channel 5 from Northern and Shell, and there is no reason against an ambitious approach to public service requirements for Channel 3, for example, in local news or regional content. And this brings me to my second point. Some, including members in this chamber, as we've heard tonight, have used the disquiet and the lack of regionally tailored television services in the south of Scotland as an argument in favour of a Scotland-wide service, as the model proposed by STV. However, as Ofcom's report noted, whilst viewers in the south of Scotland were less satisfied with Scottish news coverage from their Channel 3 licensee than those elsewhere in Scotland under STV, they placed considerably more importance than other Scots on the need for a focus on my local area. On this basis, especially when it comes to news, neither the status quo nor a Scotland-wide STV service appears to be the way forward. For this reason, I asked the Cabinet Secretary for Culture last June whether she agreed with me that local broadcasting in the Borders would be better served by having a more locally dedicated South of Scotland service, which could be supplemented with the coverage of national Scottish issues rather than a Scotland-wide service under STV proposals. I was therefore very pleased to hear in her response that the Cabinet Secretary and I were in agreement on this matter, and hope other members will join us in agreeing that this is the best way forward. One way of achieving this could be through a public service requirement obligation on licensees, and I would urge other members tonight to consider this. In this respect, I would very much welcome any proposal from ITV to enhance the news and current affairs service for Southern Scotland with a return to the traditional, smaller border region without time teas. This, I believe, would more fully reflect viewers' wishes. I will conclude by congratulating Joan McAlpine again on securing this debate and the thoughtful contributions which others have made. Thank you.
Thank you. Once again, can I make a plea for 4-minute speeches? Chick Brodie to be followed by Jim Hume.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I too welcome the debate brought by the very knowledgeable Joan McAlpine. Deputy Presiding Officer, we may or may not be bemused that Maria Miller, she of Remploy fame, says she will not block the renewal of Channel 3 television licences, with ITV still covering the Borders. She goes on to acknowledge that there are deficiencies in ITV's local and Scottish news coverage in the Borders TV region. And if you add to that her ministerial predecessor's comments that he wanted, and I quote, people to be able to watch television that is truly relevant to them, to have information about what is happening locally, and to see programmes featuring people they know. What is relevant to the Borders, to Dumfries and Galloway, and indeed to Scotland, to its communities and to its people, as we approach a momentous time in Scotland's history, is to reassure them that Gateshead, Carlisle or even Leeds are not in Scotland. We should perhaps send Ms Miller a sat-nav. The main provider of commercial television to the Borders should be Scots, and it should be STV. Deputy Presiding Officer, people in Scotland spend an average of 4.5 hours per day watching television, the highest figure in the UK. And according to Ofcom, 9 out of 10 adults consume local and national news, and 75% rate local news and weather as personal and important types of communication for them. Facts that cannot be disputed. There are some, of course, technical and cost issues regarding transmission and transmitters, but these are not insurmountable. Equally, I would suggest what is feasible is to support that national network with already proven community television, which Aileen MacLeod referred to. Communities are already setting up their own local broadband television as part of the digital network through the URTV Community News Television. The success, for example, of Helensburgh TV has now been followed by, as has been mentioned, Annandale TV, launched in May 2012, serving the communities of Annan, Lockerbie, Moffat, Gretna and Langham. And they cover major issues. In the case of Helensburgh, there's a doctor that says, who does a programme, says that he can reach 8,500 people, which would be impossible over a part of a year. The aim of such community news TV is to create a cooperative network community-run and social enterprise channels, creating a professional public service communication over broadband TV. And I believe working alongside and with major licensee for national news and programmes dedicated to the Borders and Dumfries and Galloway areas then matches the expectation of the television viewers, the customers of those in the very areas that we've been talking about. Local and television news and weather provision on digital terrestrial television managed by STV, complemented by internet protocol television such as I've mentioned Community News TV, is no less, I would suggest, no less than the people of the south of Scotland deserve.
Thank you. Call Jim Hume, to be followed by Alex Ferguson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It's a pleasure to speak in this evening's debate on a topic which I know has vexed many of my constituents, including myself, since the merger of the Border and Tyne Tees regions by ITV back in 2009. And I too congratulate John McAlpine for bringing this matter before the Chamber. I suspect, like most members across the South, my contact with constituents can often lead to conversations over the relevance of the region's news output on Channel 3. It was through such conversations that led me to make representations to the Department for Culture, Media, Sport and have meetings with both Ofcom and, alongside other members, ITV to press the case for greater Scottish Borders and Dumfries and Galloway content for the people in southern Scotland. The Secretary of State made it clear in her letter to Ofcom that she also had concerns, as others have said, over the output being received by those in southern Scotland, and I welcome her desire to see Ofcom address the concerns. I would like to make it clear my admiration for the staff at ITV Borders, who, particularly those based at Holyrood and in the region, and I'll name them Catherine Sampson and Jenny Longden, just two of them, of course, are hard-working and they produce good quality output. My issue is not with the standard of ITV Borders news output, but its relevance, as other members have related, and I'm not alone in that, obviously. The research published by Ofcom last year revealed that those who had no issue with the content of news service output were those who had low interest in regional news or were infrequent viewers, essentially those who had little need or desire to use the service in any case. Everyone else in the Stranraer, Galashiels and Dumfries focus groups had concerns over the urban bias to the north east of England that had become prevalent since the merger. I think there's an appetite for change amongst most of my constituents and indeed from most members in this chamber this evening. The question is, what shape should this change take? John McAlpine appears to support STV assuming responsibilities for the output currently provided by ITV Borders. However, people in Stranraer and Eyemouth would argue, as would I, that Glasgow is equally as remote from them as Newcastle. The consensus is that if people want national news, they will watch Reporting Scotland on the BBC, as Elaine Murray has suggested. They view Channel 3's regional news as a place for more localised content. The upcoming independence referendum necessitates relevant news output from broadcasters with public service obligations, and currently there is a problem with people being adequately informed of the goings-ons here at Holyrood, a fact compounded by the absence of Scotland Tonight from viewers in the region. And while STV News would remedy this problem, a north east of England bias would, I suspect, simply be replaced by a central belt bias. The research project made clear that while this option may have been slightly preferable to the status quo, the preferred option, as John Lammett's already mentioned, remains going back to the pre-2009 service, where seeing a news crew on the streets of Dumfries, Selkirk or Galashiels was more commonplace. So I welcome ITV's confirmation that they are discussing with Ofcom this very matter and looking at ways of retaining a local news programme with more local content. And I think this is a positive step, and I look forward to monitoring the progress of these discussions over the coming weeks.
Thank you. Call Alex Ferguson, to be followed by Stuart Stevenson.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I will be quite brief because many members have already said some of the things that I might have wanted to say. But there are a couple of issues I just wanted to touch on. The first is something that almost everybody's mentioned, which is the current dissatisfaction with the present news coverage that we get. But I think we just need to be a little bit careful about the direction in which we point the finger for the cause of that dissatisfaction. Because I have to agree certainly as a constituency member, with something Elaine Murray said, which is that many of my constituents, particularly those in the east of my constituency, are very interested in what happens in Carlisle and Cumbria, and it would be wrong just to write that off as a reason for having to look at this. And I think it's important to look at the research, which stated quite clearly that the dissatisfaction was largely because it was felt that the area covered in the current offering is too big. And therefore, I think the cause of the dissatisfaction is by the amount of actual local news to Dumfries and Galloway or the borders that is contained within that wider offering offered by ITV Regional News. And I think we need to be quite clear about that. The amount of national news is not a key driver of satisfaction. And that leads me on to the issue of real choice, which the motion mentions. Because I grew up on the west coast of Scotland, where we could only get BBC Northern Ireland, and many is the punchline of a joke and the high spot of a film that I missed because we cut to a news flash in Northern Ireland during the awful troubles that are fortunately largely behind us. So the situation we have now is an awful lot better than the one we had then, despite room for improvement. But I think we also have to recognise that the Ofcom research showed quite clearly that the respondents believe that the BBC, and Jim Hume referred to this, that the BBC's news coverage acts as quite a good complement to the ITV offering, that people see the two together. If they want national news, they will go to BBC, possibly, rather than the ITV offering, if that's what they want. So I would suggest that viewers do have a real choice, particularly when you add to that the increasing number of people who watch through digital channels and online systems and programmes. What is absolutely not in doubt is a desire for much more local coverage, and I also remember the debate back in October 2011, I think it was, when we discussed exactly that, and Chick Brodie's contribution showed very clearly what advances are being made in local stations and people taking matters into their own hand, and I very much welcome that. I also welcome the fact that Ofcom and ITV are apparently working together to try to address the concerns. They've been told to do so by Maria Miller, which I also welcome. And indeed, if some of Joan McAlpaine's suggested options to improve that are workable, then I absolutely welcome them, because there is a genuine issue here. The one thing that shines through this that everybody agrees on and is quite clear is that the vast majority of participants, and constituents in our part of Scotland, have called for a return to the footprint and indeed the format of the pre-merger ITV Border News. I would endorse that strongly, and if something like that is coming out of these discussions, then I welcome them warmly. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now call on Stuart Stevenson.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Members may wonder why someone from the North East of Scotland is participating in this debate. I did note that in the motion it says a real choice for viewers across the south of Scotland, and I thought it might be useful to just talk about what happens elsewhere in Scotland and how that might be relevant to this debate, and to talk more generally about the whole value of television as part of communities engaging with themselves and talking to each other. In the North East of Scotland, we talk about having a news. What that means is going and calling on a neighbour, having a discussion, talking about things in general. And good local media supports and sustains exactly that. Good communication and information flow also supports economic and political success. 2,000 years ago, it used to take the Greeks 30 days to send a message out to one of their outposts, and another 30 to get a message back. An incredibly long period of time. You'd forgotten what the question was when you got the answer. The Romans improved that dramatically. They could send a message from Londinium to Roma and get a reply back the same day by a system of hilltop signalling. Didn't work at night or if there was fog, but it was a huge, huge improvement. Moving rapidly forward in 1876, when Alexander Graham Bell demonstrated the telephone, a huge step forward. And by 1881, only 5 years later, Edinburgh had 300 telephone subscribers. So people want good quality communications that are relevant to them. I happen to have done family tree research for many years, and I have a letter to my great-great-grandfather, which is dated 1870. And it was written over a period of a month to tell him that one of his sons, still living in Scotland, had died because my great-great-grandfather was in Canada. This was such a precious communication, he waited until the outcome of an illness before sending it. And I think it shows that familial conversation as well as community conversation is important. I remember my father's first telephone call to the United States, 1958, had to be booked a day in advance, and it cost half the average working man's weekly wage. But today, we've got a television pattern that was established when ITV started in about 1955, and it's going to change, and it is changing. And we've already seen in STV, it isn't a monolithic news service. There are 4 separate bulletins across Scotland, but more fundamentally, as a commercial imperative, they are now reaching down into their communities and have local reporters with local websites, local TV inserts on there, which are often picked up and used. In my constituency alone, I have 2 separate STV websites in Buckie and in Peterhead. And I think that is going to turn out to be a key part of sustaining companies that were born in the mid-50s into the next 30 or 40 years, because the future will not be like the past. We see journalists from television companies, Colin White at BBC Aberdeen, goes out with a camera on his own. He writes for the web, he does for radio, he does for TV. That's going to be the pattern, getting to the root of what's going on. And I think this letter that I got from my relatives in Canada, 360 milliseconds it took, not the 360 minutes it took the Romans to talk to London. In future, it's going to be so instantaneous, it's not true. We've got to find ways of delivering for the borders. Perhaps they can show the rest of us how to do it, because their need is greatest.
Thank you, Mr Stevenson. I'm glad you returned to the borders at the end of your contribution. I now call on Fiona Hislop, Cabinet Secretary. Could you respond to the debate in around 7 minutes?
Thank you. Presiding Officer, may I also congratulate Jo McAlpine on securing this debate on a very important subject. I think she set out the issues very well indeed. And also thank you to all the other members who have spoken. And I think that we've had more members debate on this one subject of broadcasting in the south of Scotland than compared to any other single subject that we've probably debated. And I think that says something about how important people see this issue, particularly in the south of Scotland. But as the motion makes clear, the prospective relicensing of Channel 3 has particular implications for the south of Scotland, and I do want to come on to those shortly. But it also has, as a subject, concerns Scotland as a whole. Partly because it matters to all of us that viewers in the south of Scotland should, as a democratic right, be able to see news and current affairs coverage on the same basis as viewers elsewhere in Scotland, but also because, in relation to Channel 3 licensing, the future of STV as a major Scottish media company matters also to us all. Lord Thomson of Fleet, the Canadian media entrepreneur Roy Thomson, who first acquired the Scottish television licence back in 1957, described an independent television franchise as, like, I quote, like having your own licence to print money. Broadcasting has moved on. In 1957, there were only 2 channels. Now there are almost 50 in free-to-air terrestrial television and many hundreds through cable and satellite. And the move from analogue television to digital, cable and satellite services has greatly increased the choice available. Now, that's good news for viewers. For broadcasters, though, one of the consequences is that simply owning a channel does not guarantee success. Where Lord Thomson printed money, now it has to be earned by quality programming. So it's good to see STV doing so well. In 2011, pre-tax profits rose by 12%. Now, STV have also won the local television licences for Edinburgh and Glasgow. We would have preferred a different model for local television, one that through a Scottish digital network with local opt-out programming would have met John Lamont's call for local coverage in the borders and indeed elsewhere. Clearly, STV had to bid for what was an offer and are to be congratulated on their success against competition. Let me add that as STV will not be taking up the minimum £300,000 BBC funding for local television content, It is vital that it is used to boost BBC Scotland's news and current affairs resources, which are already being cut severely, and I am writing to the BBC Acting Director General to that effect. Now, of course, a public sector broadcaster should not just be judged on financial success or even on the employment it generates. The key test is how far public service broadcasting requirements are met. Here too, STV is doing well. The advice from Ofcom to the Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport and Channel 3 relicensing in May of last year specifically praised the level of regional news programming put out by STV and mentioned by a number of members here today. And the recent announcement by the Culture Secretary that she will allow Ofcom to proceed to renew Channel 3 licences for a further 10-year period is to be welcomed for STV. That ensures a stable basis on which to plan for the future. And I also welcome that renewal will also be on condition of addressing the issues in the south of Scotland. The Scottish Government has persistently pushed for this. It was highlighted by the Scottish Broadcasting Commission that we established in 2007. I have personally pursued the case in meetings with the chief executives of both STV and ITV and in meetings and correspondence with UK ministers. And I know that many members of this Parliament have also pushed the cause. I welcome the fact that so many have done so again tonight, and it's clearly right that viewers across Scotland should receive coverage about Scottish health and Scottish education and the whole range of matters devolved to the Parliament in a way that's appropriate to their experience, their locality and what matters to them. And it's a case under devolution I think we should also consider, because it is about reflecting to people what matters to them and their experiences. But also it's a cause that is now more important than ever, as over the next 2 years Scotland approaches its most momentous decision in over 300 years. And that highlights a problem of timing. The renewal of the Channel 3 licences will take effect at the earliest from the 1st of January 2015, after the independence referendum to be held in autumn 2014. So it's essential to see progress in the south of Scotland, not just in the context of the new licences, but under the existing licences. So let me give an example of why that is needed, and indeed soon. In spring of this year, which however wintry it might seem now is not that far away, STV will be showing a major three-part, 3-hour documentary on the background to the current debate entitled The Road to the Referendum. This series will take an in-depth look at how the constitutional debate has evolved over the past few decades. And that is exactly the sort of programming which people in the south of Scotland deserve to see as much as people in the rest of Scotland, regardless of what side of the debate you be on, and an appropriate slot in the schedule rather than the small hours, as part of a condition to inform and educate part of public service broadcasting. And I know that ITV has in the past made available significant events like the debates in the Scottish Parliament election in 2011, and I call them to take a similar proactive stance during the next 2 years. And I would emphasise that this is about democracy. It causes me concern that people see it a political way. It is about educating and informing as part of public service broadcasting. And we all have an interest in seeing a referendum that fully meets modern democratic standards, of which adequate coverage in broadcast media must surely be part in all of Scotland. If Dumfries and Galloway and the Borders do not have the same extent and range of coverage, it will result in a democratic deficit in public service broadcasting. So we are embarking, and we will see Ofcom consulting on Channel 3 relicensing, which will obviously take place after 2015 and the dates that I referred to. But in that consultation, we need 3 particular points. One, an open consultation that involves everyone and does not just reflect negotiation with the licence holders. Secondly, an informed consultation that sets out all the options, including for adjusting the transmission infrastructure to direct Scottish content to Scotland. And thirdly, a consultation, and probably most importantly, a consultation rooted in the public service broadcasting mission to inform, to educate and to entertain. Presiding Officer, the interest in democracy transcends any party political interest. That is why the subject on which all parties in this Parliament, I think, can unite. But it's important that we think about the Channel 3 relicensing, not just in what happens after the relicensing, but what happens in the period up until the relicensing. And I think the intensity and indeed the intellectual argument that has been put forward by everyone, very much informed by the experience of local constituents I think is very well founded. This is not an issue that will easily go away. It shouldn't go away because I think, and I agree with all of you, that your constituents deserve better. We have yet to see what that better looks like, but what we can all agree on is that they deserve better.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. That concludes Joan McAlpine's debate on South of Scotland television, and I now close this meeting of Parliament.